In the depths of a winter so cruel that even memory seemed to freeze, there came a time when hunger transformed the very meaning of survival. Hello, friends, and welcome to tonight's journey through history. As you settle into your blankets and let the day drift away, I invite you to travel back through the mists of time, to a winter that tested the limits of human endurance and revealed the quiet strength that lives within us all. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let us walk together through the snow-laden streets of a world long past. The year was 1437, and across the northern reaches of Europe, winter arrived not as a season but as a sentence. It came early that year, slipping down from the Arctic lands in late October like an uninvited guest who would overstay their welcome for months beyond counting. The first snows fell on the feast day of All Hallows, dusting the harvest fields that had already yielded far less than anyone had hoped. The farmers looked up at the gray sky with expressions that mixed resignation with a creeping dread they dare not speak aloud. They had seen poor harvests before. They had weathered difficult winters, but something in the air that autumn whispered of trials yet to come, of a cold that would sink its teeth deep into the land and refuse to let go. In the German territories, in the Low Countries, across Scandinavia and the Baltic regions, the story was much the same. The summer had been wet and sunless, a dreary succession of gray days that left the grain rotting in the fields before it could properly ripen. What wheat and rye the peasants managed to harvest was thin and meager, the kernels small and hard, already showing signs of ergot and blight. The root vegetables came up stunted from the waterlogged soil. The fruit trees, confused by the strange weather, had bloomed late and borne little. Even before the first frost, the wise householders were rationing their stores, calculating with grim arithmetic how little they could eat each day and still survive until spring. But spring was farther away than anyone imagined. As November descended, the temperature plummeted with shocking speed. Ponds that usually took until December to freeze solid were bearing the weight of horses by the middle of the month. The Baltic Sea began to ice over in great sheets that groaned and cracked like the voices of giants in pain. Rivers slowed to a crawl and then stopped entirely, their surfaces transforming into highways of ice that connected villages that had always been separated by flowing water. It would have been beautiful, this crystalline transformation of the world, if it had not been so terrifying. In the city of Lübeck, one of the great Hanseatic ports that controlled trade across the northern seas, the council members met in their grand hall and discussed the situation in low, worried voices. The grain stores in the city warehouses were adequate, they told themselves, but not abundant. They would need to ration carefully. They would need to prevent hoarding. And most critically, they would need to ensure that no grain left the city. For if word spread that Lübeck was selling its stores, people would flood in from the countryside, and there would never be enough to feed them all. It was a cruel calculation, but these were men who had survived previous famines, who had learned that sentiment and mercy could doom an entire population if applied too freely. They posted guards at the warehouses and published proclamations limiting each household's weekly allotment of grain. The city held its breath and waited. In the countryside, where no such organized rationing existed, the situation grew desperate with frightening speed. The peasants who worked the land had always lived close to the edge of survival, even in good years. Their entire existence was built around the harvest, around storing enough food to last through the winter months when nothing grew. A family might have a small plot where they grew cabbage and turnips, kept a pig or two, perhaps a few chickens if they were fortunate. The lord of the manor took his portion first, of course, his tithe of grain and livestock, his claim to the peasants' labor. What remained had to sustain them until the next growing season. In an average year, there might be lean weeks in late winter when everyone was tired of turnip soup and black bread, when belts were tightened and children whimpered with hunger before sleep. But they survived. They always had. This year was different. By mid-December, families who had thought their stores adequate were staring at the bottoms of their grain barrels with growing horror. The flour was running out. The salted pork that should have lasted until March was nearly gone. The chickens had stopped laying in the bitter cold and were being slaughtered one by one, their thin flesh barely providing a meal. People began to eye their remaining livestock with desperate calculations. How long could they keep the cow alive? Would the milk she provided be worth more than her meat? But what would they do for milk next spring if they slaughtered her now? These impossible choices multiplied with each passing day as the cold deepened and the snow continued to fall. And fall it did, in quantities that the old men could not remember seeing in their lifetimes. Snow piled against the walls of cottages until it reached the eaves. Paths had to be dug and redug daily just to reach the barn or the well. The forest, where peasants normally went to gather deadwood and set snares for rabbits, became impenetrable, a white wilderness where a man could lose his way between one tree and the next. The animals that might have been hunted vanished into deep burrows or fled to warmer lands. Even the crows, usually so numerous and bold, seemed to have abandoned the frozen landscape. By January, people were eating things they never would have considered food in normal times. Tree bark was stripped from the less bitter species, boiled into a mucilaginous gruel that filled the stomach if not the soul. Leather straps and old belts were soaked and scraped, the hair removed, then boiled for hours until they broke down into something theoretically edible. The wealthy, in their stone houses with their great fireplaces, were tightening their belts, serving smaller portions on their platters, and watering their wine more than usual. But it was the poor, as always, who felt the teeth of winter bite the deepest. In a small village called Rothbach, nestled in a valley of the Harz Mountains, there lived a widow named Margaret. She was perhaps 40 years of age, though hardship had aged her beyond her years, her hands roughened by labor, her face creased by sun and wind and worry. Her husband had died 3 winters past, taken by a fever that no amount of prayer or poultice could cure. She had 2 children, a daughter of 16 named Anna, fair-haired and gentle, who had inherited her father's kind eyes, and a son of 12 named Jochen, small for his age but quick and clever, with a curiosity that sometimes got him into trouble. They lived in a cottage at the edge of the village, a small structure of timber and stone with a thatched roof that leaked in heavy rain and a floor of packed earth that was never quite level. Margaret had done everything she could to prepare for winter. She had worked extra days for the lord of the manor, accepting payment in grain rather than copper pennies. She had gathered every nut and mushroom she could find in the forest during autumn. She had tended her small garden with devotion, coaxing the maximum yield from every plant. And still, it was not enough. By the time January arrived with its savage cold, she was already rationing their food to portions that left all three of them dizzy with hunger. The bread she baked was more chaff and ground acorns than flour. The soup she made contained more water than substance, flavored with a ham bone she had been boiling and reboiling until it had given up every molecule of taste it possessed. Anna, being the eldest, took it upon herself to eat less so that her brother might have more. Margaret noticed this sacrifice, and her heart broke even as she felt a fierce pride in her daughter. She tried to insist that Anna eat her full portion, but the girl was stubborn in her selflessness, slipping bits of bread to Jachin when she thought her mother wasn't looking, claiming she was not hungry even as her dress began to hang more loosely on her frame. Jachin, for his part, was still young enough to be constantly, desperately hungry, his growing body crying out for sustenance that simply did not exist. He tried not to complain, tried to be brave as his mother told him he must be, but at night Margaret could hear him crying softly in the darkness, whimpering about his empty belly. The lord of the manor, a man named Graf Heinrich von Rothbach, was not a cruel master by the standards of the time, but neither was he particularly generous. He lived in a small castle on the hill overlooking the village, a fortified house of gray stone that had stood for 2 centuries. When reports reached him of the desperate conditions in the village, he opened his grain stores enough to prevent outright starvation, but only just. His steward distributed small measures of rye to each household, barely enough to keep them alive. Graf's own stores, he reasoned, had to last the winter as well, and he had his own household to consider, his own servants and men-at-arms to feed. If he gave too freely, they would all starve together. It was cold logic, the mathematics of survival that left no room for compassion. As January dragged toward February, with no sign of the cold abating, strange new economies emerged. People began to trade anything that might have value for anything that might be eaten. A woman might exchange her wedding ring for a handful of dried peas. A man might trade his only spare shirt for a cup of flour. Children were sent begging from door to door, though every door was home to people just as hungry as they were. The village became a place of haunted eyes and hollow cheeks, where people moved slowly to conserve their energy, where conversations were brief because talking required strength that no one could spare. It was during the first week of February that Margaret found herself staring at a pair of old leather boots that had belonged to her husband. They sat in the corner of the cottage where they had sat since his death, sturdy boots made by a skilled cobbler, well crafted with good thick leather. She had kept them all this time, unable to bring herself to part with them, one of the few remaining traces of the man she had loved. But now, with Anna growing weaker by the day and Jachin's ribs beginning to show sharp through his skin, she found herself thinking thoughts that would have seemed mad in any other time. Leather could be boiled. She had heard of people doing such things in desperate times. The leather would break down, eventually becoming soft enough to chew and swallow. It would provide something, some small amount of sustenance. It would not be pleasant, it would not truly satisfy. But it might be enough to keep them alive a few more weeks, long enough for spring to arrive, for the snow to melt, for life to return to the frozen world. She waited until the children were asleep that night, lying close together under their shared blanket for warmth, their breathing shallow but steady. Then, moving quietly in the dim light of the single candle she allowed herself each evening, Margaret took her husband's boots and set them on the table. She looked at them for a long time, these boots that had walked beside her to church on Sunday mornings, that had stood by the door waiting for him to come home each evening. She thought about the man who had worn them, his laugh, his strength, the way he had held her on cold nights. She thought about how he would have hated to see his family suffering like this, how he would have done anything to protect them. And she knew that if his spirit could see her now, he would understand. He would want her to do whatever was necessary to keep their children alive. With hands that trembled only slightly, she took a knife and began to cut the boots into smaller pieces. The leather was thick and tough, resisting the blade, but she worked patiently, cutting careful strips and chunks. Some of the leather was newer, from repairs that had been made over the years. Some were older, darker, worn smooth by use. All of it went into the pot. She filled the pot with water from the bucket by the door, water that had a skin of ice on top that she had to break through. She hung the pot over the fire, adding another precious piece of wood to the coals, and settled down to wait. The boiling of leather is not a quick process. It requires patience, constant heat, and time measured in hours rather than minutes. Margaret sat by the fire through most of the night, occasionally stirring the contents of the pot, watching as the leather slowly began to soften. The smell was strange, not entirely unpleasant, but not appealing either. An earthy animal scent that filled the small cottage. As the water heated and cooled and heated again, the leather began to break down, releasing whatever nutritional value it held into the water. By morning, what had been recognizable pieces of boot had become a murky soup filled with soft, gelatinous fragments. When Anna woke and saw what her mother had done, she understood immediately. No words were needed. She simply came to her mother's side and squeezed her hand, and Margaret saw tears on her daughter's cheeks, though whether they were tears of sadness for the loss of her father's boots or relief at the prospect of food, she could not say. Perhaps it was both. Jachin, when he woke, was more practical in his youth. He peered into the pot with curiosity and asked, "Will it taste good, Mama?" Margaret had to smile despite everything. "No, my love," she said honestly. "It will not taste good, but it will help fill your belly." She served them each a bowl of the leather soup, such as it was. The broth was thin and brownish, with a flavor that was difficult to describe, somewhere between bitter and bland, with an aftertaste of tannin that made the mouth feel dry. The pieces of leather, softened by hours of boiling, could be chewed and swallowed, though they were tough and required patience. It was not nourishing in the way that meat or grain was nourishing, but it was something. It was enough to quiet the worst pangs of hunger for a few hours. It was enough to give them the strength to make it through another day. Word spread through the village about what Margaret had done, and soon other families were looking at their own old shoes and belts with new eyes. The cobbler, a man named Thomas who had been struggling to feed his own 5 children, found himself in the strange position of having a sudden demand for old leather goods. People brought him scraps and worn-out boots, items they would normally have tried to repair, and asked if he had any leather he could spare. He did what he could, trading small pieces of leather for whatever people could offer, though often the trades were so desperate that he gave the leather freely, knowing that copper pennies or promised future labor meant nothing if people died before spring arrived. The priest of the village, Father Bernhard, was a man torn between his duties and his limitations. He preached sermons about trusting in God's providence, about the virtue of patience in suffering, about how trials of the flesh were opportunities to strengthen the spirit. But he also saw the reality of his congregation, saw the children growing thin and listless, saw the old people who simply did not wake up one morning, having slipped away in the night from cold and hunger. He opened the small stores of the church, distributing what little grain had been collected as tithes, but it was a pittance against the vast need. He spent his nights on his knees, praying for an early spring, for a miracle, for anything that might save these people he had shepherded for 20 years. His prayers rose into the cold air of the stone church and seemed to vanish into the same silence that had settled over the frozen land. The practice of boiling leather spread through Rothbach and into the neighboring villages like a grim recipe passed from household to household. What had once been unthinkable became routine, simply another strategy for survival in a winter that refused to end. Women gathered at the well, their faces pinched with cold and hunger, and discussed which types of leather were easiest to soften, which required the longest boiling, which left the least unpleasant aftertaste. Old saddles were dismantled, their leather cut into strips. Work gloves that had been passed down through generations were sacrificed to the pot. Even the leather hinges on some doors and the straps on wooden buckets disappeared, contributing to the desperate effort to stay alive. In the castle on the hill, Graf Heinrich heard reports of what his people were doing and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of him was horrified that things had deteriorated to such a point. Part of him felt a grim admiration for the resourcefulness and determination to survive. He ordered his steward to conduct another inventory of the grain stores, hoping to find some reserve that might allow for increased rations, but the numbers were unforgiving. The castle household itself was on reduced portions. His men-at-arms, who needed strength to patrol and maintain order, were already complaining of weakness. If he gave more to the village, his own people would suffer proportionally. And yet, if the villagers died, who would work his fields when spring finally came? Who would pay rents and tithes? Graf was not a man given to sentiment, but he understood the cold practicalities of the feudal system. Dead peasants served no one. He made a decision that he knew would be unpopular among his own household. He would reduce the rations for everyone in the castle by another small measure and distribute the saved grain to the village. It would not be much, but it might be enough to prevent the worst. His wife, the Gräfin Adelheid, protested that they were already eating like commoners, that their children were going hungry, that he was being foolish. But Heinrich held firm. "If the village dies," he told her quietly, "we die with them, only more slowly. We need these people." She did not like his answer, but she was practical enough to see the truth in it. The grain was distributed. February crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Each day was indistinguishable from the last. Gray skies, bitter cold, snow that fell or blew or simply hung in the air like frozen fog. The sun, when it appeared at all, was a pale disk offering light without warmth, rising late and setting early, as if it too had grown tired of this endless winter. People marked time not by days of the week, but by simple survival. Waking up was a victory. Making it to nightfall was an accomplishment. Sleep became both an escape and a danger. For some who lay down in the cold simply never woke again, their bodies having given up the struggle while their minds wandered in dreams. Margareth's family survived through those dark weeks on a combination of the leather soup, occasional handfuls of grain from the Graf's distributions, and a kind of stubborn determination that seemed to run in their blood. Anna had stopped menstruating, her body shutting down non-essential functions to conserve energy. Jochen no longer had the strength to play or run, but spent his days huddled by the fire, helping his mother with small tasks that did not require much physical effort. He sorted the few remaining dried beans, picking out the ones that had gone bad. He helped tear the leather into smaller pieces before it went into the pot. He told stories to distract them all from their hunger, fantastical tales of knights and dragons that he made up as he went along, his imagination still vivid even as his body weakened. One morning in mid-February, Anna did not get up when her mother called her. Margaret went to her daughter's pallet and found the girl curled on her side, her breathing shallow, her skin cold to the touch. Panic seized Margaret's heart. "Anna," she said urgently, shaking her daughter's shoulder. "Anna, wake up." The girl's eyelids fluttered and eventually opened, but her gaze was unfocused, distant. "So tired, Mama," she whispered. "Just let me sleep a little more." But Margaret knew, with the instinct of a mother who has seen too much suffering, that if Anna went back to sleep now, she might never wake. Some line had been crossed in the night, some threshold of weakness beyond which the body simply gave up. "No," Margaret said firmly, though her voice shook. "No, you must get up. You must move. Come, I will help you." She pulled Anna to a sitting position, ignoring her daughter's protests, and half-carried, half-dragged her to the fire. Jochen watched with frightened eyes but said nothing, understanding somehow that this was a crisis. Margaret wrapped Anna in their warmest blanket and made her drink warm water, not the leather broth, just water heated over the fire, forcing small sips past her daughter's lips. Then she did something she had been saving for the most desperate moment. She went to a hidden corner of the cottage and retrieved a small cloth bag that contained 3 eggs, the last eggs their final chicken had laid before it too had been eaten. She had been hoarding these eggs for weeks, telling herself she would save them for when they were most needed. That moment had arrived. She cracked the eggs into a bowl and beat them with a fork, then cooked them in a tiny amount of precious fat over the fire. The smell of cooking eggs filled the cottage, rich and almost overwhelming after weeks of nothing but leather soup and thin grain porridge. Jachin's stomach growled audibly, and Margaret saw him swallow hard, but she divided the eggs only 2 ways, half for Anna, half for Jachin. She took none for herself. Anna tried to protest, tried to insist her mother eat, but Margaret was firm. "You need strength," she said. "Both of you. I am older. I will manage." It was not entirely true, but it was the kind of lie that mothers tell, the kind of sacrifice that needs no explanation. The eggs helped. Anna's color improved slightly over the course of the day, and by evening she was able to sit up on her own and speak in sentences. But the incident had frightened all of them, showing just how close to the edge they were walking. Margaret knew they could not survive much longer on what they had. The leather from her husband's boots was gone, consumed days ago. She had one old belt left, thin and cracked, and a pair of worn gloves. That was all. When those were gone, they would have only the sporadic grain distributions and whatever roots or tree bark they could gather. It would not be enough. That night, after the children slept, Margaret allowed herself something she rarely permitted. She cried. Not loud, racking sobs that might wake Anna and Jachin, but silent tears that ran down her face as she stared into the dying fire. She had tried so hard. She had done everything a person could do, and still it was not enough. She found herself praying, bargaining with God in the way people do when they are desperate. "Please," she whispered into the darkness. "Please let them live. Take me if you must take someone, but let my children live." The fire popped and settled, sending up a small shower of sparks, and she wondered if that was God's answer or just the random behavior of burning wood. In other parts of the village, similar scenes were playing out. Thomas the cobbler, who had given away so much of his leather to help others, found himself with nothing left to feed his own family. His wife, Maria, had a haunted look in her eyes as she watched their youngest child, a boy of only 4 years, grow weaker each day. The child no longer cried when he was hungry. He simply sat quietly, listlessly, too tired to make noise. Thomas had heard rumors of villages farther north where people had resorted to even more desperate measures, things he did not want to think about, things that violated every law of God and man. He pushed those thoughts away and instead took his tools, his awls and needles and knives, the implements of his trade, and walked through the snow to the castle to offer them in trade for food. The steward looked at the tools and shook his head sadly. "What would we do with cobbler's tools when we have no leather?" he asked, not unkindly. But then he saw the desperation in Thomas's eyes and sighed. He gave the cobbler a small measure of grain anyway, though he made Thomas promise to work it off in labor when spring came. Thomas agreed to anything, taking the grain with shaking hands and stumbling back through the snow to his family. Father Bernhard had taken to spending entire days in the church, not because it was significantly warmer there. It was not, but because he felt he should be available to his flock at all times. People came to him with questions that had no good answers. They asked why God was punishing them, what sins they had committed to deserve such suffering. The priest did his best to comfort them, to remind them that suffering was not always punishment, that God's ways were mysterious and beyond human understanding. But privately, in his own prayers, Father Bernhard wrestled with these same questions. He had devoted his life to the church and had tried to be a good shepherd to his people. Why was this happening? Where was the mercy, the compassion, the divine intervention that the scriptures promised to the faithful? He had seen so many die already. Old Werner, who had rung the church bells for 40 years, had been found frozen in his bed one morning. The baker's wife had succumbed to a fever brought on by malnutrition. 3 children from different families, all under the age of 6, had died within the same week. Father Bernhard had performed the burial rites, or at least the winter version of them. The ground was too frozen to dig graves, so the bodies were taken to a shed outside the village and laid in rows, covered with snow, waiting for the thaw when they could be properly interred. Each death diminished them all, removing another thread from the fabric of their community, leaving them weaker and more afraid. The priest had one small advantage that most of his parishioners lacked. He received a stipend from the diocese, a small amount of money that theoretically allowed him to purchase food. But there was no food to purchase. The traveling merchants who normally moved between villages had stopped coming, the roads too dangerous and impassable, their own stores too limited to spare anything for trade. The few shops in Rothbach had nothing to sell. Money, Father Bernhard realized, was meaningless in the face of absolute scarcity. You could not eat gold coins. A full purse would not keep you warm. He had a small store of communion wine and a few wafers, but these were sacred items, meant for the Mass, not for consumption as regular food. Or were they? In the darkest part of his soul, he wondered if God would forgive him for distributing the communion elements to starving children. Was it not a kind of communion in itself, sharing what little there was? But he did not act on these thoughts, not yet. He waited and prayed and hoped. By the 3rd week of February, a curious thing began to happen in Rothbach. The intense suffering, the shared desperation, started to create bonds between people that might not have existed in easier times. Those who had slightly more shared with those who had nothing, not out of any expectation of repayment, but simply because they were all in this together, all struggling against the same implacable enemy of cold and hunger. A farmer who had managed to save a small amount of dried meat shared it with his neighbors. A woman who had found a cache of turnips that had survived in her root cellar gave half of them away. These acts of kindness were small, insignificant against the vast scale of the crisis, but they mattered. They reminded people that they were still human, still capable of compassion, still connected to one another by something more than simple proximity. Margaret experienced this solidarity firsthand when another widow in the village, a woman named Gerda, appeared at her door one evening with a bundle wrapped in cloth. "I heard your Anna was ill," Gerda said without preamble. "I have this. It is not much, but perhaps it will help." She pressed the bundle into Margaret's hands and turned to leave before any thanks could be offered. Margaret opened the cloth and found inside it a piece of smoked fish, no larger than her palm, dry and hard but unmistakably real food. Her eyes filled with tears. She knew that Goethe had almost nothing, that this fish represented a sacrifice of potentially life-saving proportions. She called after the other woman, "Goethe, I cannot." But Goethe waved her hand dismissively without turning around. "We help each other," she said simply. "That is what we do," and she disappeared into the snowy darkness. Margaret divided the fish into tiny portions, making it last 3 days, and it did help. Anna's strength returned somewhat, enough that she could walk around the cottage again and could help with small tasks. But Margaret's condition was deteriorating. She had been giving most of her food to the children for weeks now, telling herself that she needed less, that she could manage on almost nothing. Her body was beginning to tell a different story. She felt cold all the time, even close to the fire. Her hands shook when she tried to do fine work. When she stood up too quickly, the world swam and she had to steady herself against the wall. She knew these signs and had seen them in others. She was starving, slowly but surely, and there was nothing to be done about it except continue on and hope that spring came before her body gave out entirely. March arrived with no change in the weather. If anything, it seemed to grow colder, as if winter was making one final, malicious push before retreating. The snow that fell now was different from the earlier snows, drier, harder, more like tiny pellets of ice that stung the face and hands. The wind picked up, howling around the cottages at night like a living thing seeking entrance. People stuffed rags into every crack and gap in their walls, desperate to keep out the cold, but it found its way in any way, seeping through wood and stone, turning every dwelling into barely more than a windbreak. The leather was all gone now in most households, every scrap having been boiled and consumed. People moved on to other impossible things. They boiled bones that had already been boiled multiple times, extracting phantom nourishment from calcium and marrow that had long since been depleted. They ate candles, the tallow providing some small amount of fat, though it made them sick. They chewed on pieces of wood, not because wood had any nutritional value, but because the act of chewing, of having something in the mouth, provided a psychological comfort that was its own form of sustenance. In the castle, Graf Heinrich faced a mutiny of sorts. His men-at-arms, hungry and cold and tired of reduced rations, confronted him and demanded that he stop giving grain to the village. "Let them fend for themselves," the captain of the guard said bluntly. "We are soldiers. We need our strength. If we grow too weak to defend this place, what good are we to anyone?" The Graf understood their position, even sympathized with it to a degree. But he also understood that what they were really asking him to do was write off an entire village, to let dozens of people die so that a few dozen soldiers could be slightly less hungry. He could not bring himself to give that order. "We will all continue on reduced rations," he said firmly. "Soldiers and villagers alike. When one of us dies, we all die a little. That is the nature of this place, this community. I will not abandon these people." The men grumbled but ultimately accepted his decision, though the Graf knew he had lost some of their respect, some of their loyalty. That was the price of the choice he had made, and he would pay it. That night, alone in his private chamber, Heinrich allowed himself to wonder if he was being foolish, if his principles were condemning everyone to death when a more ruthless leader might save at least some. But he could not bring himself to change course. He had made his decision, and he would live or die by it. The Gräfin Adelheid, for her part, had become almost skeletal. She had been a beautiful woman once, plump and rosy-cheeked, given to laughter and fine dresses. Now she was a shadow, her clothes hanging on her frame, her face all sharp angles and hollow spaces. She rarely complained, but Heinrich could see the suffering in her eyes. Their children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 7, had grown quiet and listless, no longer playing or arguing as children should. They sat for hours staring at nothing, conserving their energy, waiting for meals that never quite filled their bellies. Heinrich sometimes wondered if they would survive this, if any of them would, or if future generations would find this castle empty and abandoned, its occupants having vanished like smoke in the endless winter. In the village, Father Bernhard made a decision that he had been avoiding for weeks. He could not watch any more children die. He simply could not. The sacred elements of communion, the wine and the wafers, were meant to be symbols of Christ's body and blood, not actual sustenance. But in a time of such extreme need, might not God forgive their use to save lives? Was it not a greater sin to hoard these items in a locked cabinet while children starved? The priest wrestled with his conscience for an entire night, and by morning he had made his choice. He announced from the pulpit the next Sunday that he would be distributing the communion elements to any family with young children. In addition to celebrating Mass, it was not much: a few sips of wine, a small wafer of unleavened bread. But it was something. Some of the more devout parishioners were scandalized, muttering that the priest was committing sacrilege, that he would be punished by the church authorities. But most people simply accepted the offering with gratitude, seeing it for what it was: a desperate man trying to do good in an impossible situation. Father Bernhard waited for divine retribution, for some sign that he had transgressed unforgivably, but none came. The sky did not open. No lightning struck him down. There was only the same cold, the same snow, the same grinding struggle to survive another day. Margaret took her children to receive the communion elements, and the wine, sour and thin as it was, seemed like the finest vintage she had ever tasted. Jochen drank his portion carefully, savoring every drop, and afterward pronounced it, "Very good, Mama." Anna, always more thoughtful, seemed to understand the weight of what Father Bernhard had done, the spiritual risk he had taken on their behalf. She thanked him quietly, and the priest laid his hand on her head in blessing, though who was blessing him was unclear at that moment. The days of March continued their slow procession. Each morning brought the question: had the weather changed? Was it warmer? Was the snow melting? And each morning brought the same disappointing answer: no, not yet, not today. But even in the depths of despair, humans are creatures of hope. They cannot help it. It is built into their nature. And so even as people continued to weaken and die, even as the situation grew more desperate, there remained a stubborn belief that spring would come, that they would survive, that all of this suffering would eventually end. Margaret clung to this hope even as her own body betrayed her more each day. She had developed a cough that would not go away, a deep rattling in her chest that left her breathless and exhausted. Anna and Jachin watched their mother with growing alarm, seeing in her the same signs they had seen in others who had died. But Margaret refused to give in to weakness. She continued to boil the remaining belt and gloves into soup. She continued to portion out their meager rations. She continued to tell her children that everything would be all right, even though she was no longer sure she believed it herself. One night, feverish and aching, Margaret had a dream. She dreamed she was walking through a summer meadow, the grass green and tall, wildflowers blooming in profusion. The sun was warm on her face, truly warm, not the pale and distant thing it had become. Her husband was there, young and healthy as he had been when they first married, and he was smiling at her. "Not yet," he said gently. "You are not ready to come with me yet. They still need you." And she wanted to argue, wanted to tell him how tired she was, how much she wanted to rest. But she knew he was right. She woke from the dream with tears on her face and a renewed determination. She would not die. Not yet, not while her children still needed her. The turning point when it came was subtle. It was not a single dramatic moment, but rather a gradual shift that happened over the course of several days in mid-March. The wind, which had been blowing from the north for months, shifted to come from the west. The temperature, while still well below freezing, rose slightly. And most importantly, the quality of the light changed. The sun, when it appeared through the clouds, seemed somehow more present, more vital. These were small things, easily missed, but people who had been watching desperately for any sign of change noticed immediately. "It is breaking," Thomas the cobbler said to his wife one morning, standing at their door and looking up at the sky. "The winter is finally breaking." Maria wanted to believe him but was afraid to hope, afraid of being disappointed again. "How can you tell?" she asked. He pointed to the icicles hanging from their eaves. "Look," he said. "They are dripping. Just a little, but they are dripping. The ice is melting," and it was true. In the marginally warmer air, the icicles were releasing tiny drops of water that fell into the snow below, creating small divots. It was the first time in months that anything had melted. Word spread through the village with a speed that seemed impossible given how weakened everyone was. People came out of their cottages to confirm what Thomas had seen, to witness for themselves this miraculous thing, dripping water. It sounds absurd, perhaps, that such a small thing could generate such excitement, but to people who had been trapped in frozen hell for 4 months, it was the most beautiful sight imaginable. It meant that spring was coming. Not today, perhaps not even next week, but soon. The iron grip of winter was loosening, and they might actually survive. In the castle, Graf Heinrich allowed himself a moment of relief when his steward brought him the news. They had made it. By the thinnest of margins, by sacrificing and suffering and making hard choices, they had made it through. Not everyone had survived. He knew the count of the dead, had heard the reports, but enough had lived that the village and the estate would continue. There would be people to work the fields when planting season came. There would be children to grow up and have children of their own. The continuity that every lord both depended on and was responsible for protecting had been preserved. Father Bernhard gave a special Mass of Thanksgiving, though most of his parishioners were too weak to attend. Those who did come wept openly as he spoke of God's mercy, of the end of their trial, of the hope of resurrection and renewal. He looked out at the gaunt faces in the pews and felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that it was ending, sorrow for those who had not lived to see this day, and a quiet pride in these people who had endured the unendurable. They had suffered, yes, but they had not lost their humanity. They had helped each other. They had maintained their faith, or most of them had. They had proven that even in the darkest times, there remained something worth preserving, something noble in the human spirit. Margaret heard about the thaw secondhand, being too ill to leave her cottage. But when Anna came rushing in with the news, her eyes bright with excitement for the first time in months, Margaret felt a weight lift from her chest. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. She looked at her children, thin and worn but alive, unmistakably alive, and felt a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether she was thanking God or her husband's spirit or simply the universe itself, she could not have said. "Thank you." The thaw, once it began, proceeded with maddening slowness. It was not a sudden transformation from winter to spring, but rather a gradual negotiation between the two seasons, with winter reluctant to relinquish its hold. Some days the temperature would rise enough for the snow to soften and the icicles to drip steadily, their musical plinking a sound that people had almost forgotten existed. Other days the cold would return with renewed vigor, as if winter was having second thoughts about its departure, freezing everything solid again, and dashing the hopes of those who had dared to celebrate too soon. But the overall trend was undeniable. By the third week of March, patches of dark earth began to appear where the snow had melted away, first on the southern slopes that received the most sun, then gradually spreading to other areas. The sight of bare ground was almost shocking after months of unrelieved white, and people stood staring at these muddy patches as if they were precious jewels. The earth looked dead, of course, still frozen beneath the surface, but it was visible, and that meant something. It meant the world was returning. The river that ran through the valley began to make sounds again, creaking and groaning as the ice started to break up, great sheets splitting and shifting with noises like thunder. During the day, meltwater would flow in thin streams along the surface of the ice. At night, it would freeze again, creating new patterns and formations. The children of the village, those who had survived and who had the strength, would go down to watch this process, fascinated by the power of water to transform itself from solid to liquid and back again. Jochen was among them, though Margaret made him promise to stay well back from the edge, fearful that the ice would give way and swallow him. With the thaw came new challenges that nobody had quite anticipated. The snow, as it melted, revealed the damage that winter had wrought. Roofs that had held under the weight of snow for months suddenly collapsed as the wet snow became too heavy. The thatched roofs were particularly vulnerable, many of them having rotted beneath their burden of ice and moisture. Families found themselves scrambling to repair or replace their roofs, even as they struggled with continued hunger and weakness. Thomas the cobbler, who had some skill with carpentry in addition to his leather work, found himself in sudden demand, though he was almost too weak to lift a hammer. The melting snow also revealed the bodies of those who had died outside during the worst of the winter, travelers who had tried to make it from one village to another and had frozen along the way, villagers who had gone out to gather wood and had not made it back. These frozen corpses appeared one by one as the snow receded, grim reminders of the winter's toll. Father Bernhard organized burial parties to collect the bodies and prepare them for interment once the ground thawed enough to dig graves. It was grim work, made worse by the fact that many of the dead were unidentifiable, their features obscured by ice and the changes that death and cold had wrought upon them. Margaret's cough had not improved with the warmer weather. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse, the rattling in her chest deeper and more persistent. Anna tried to get her mother to rest, to stay in bed and let her daughter take over the household tasks, but Margaret was stubborn. She had kept them alive through the worst of winter, and she was determined to see them through to true spring, to the time when food would be available again and they could begin to rebuild their lives. She pushed herself to cook what little food they had, to maintain the fire, to keep their cottage functioning. But Anna could see the cost of this determination in her mother's face, in the way she had to pause and catch her breath after any exertion, in the fever that made her skin hot to the touch. The Graf's steward made another grain distribution in late March, slightly larger than the previous ones. The castle stores were almost depleted, but Heinrich had calculated that they could spare a bit more now that the worst was past. Wild plants would soon be edible again, the first green shoots of spring herbs and early vegetables. People could begin to forage in the forest. The crisis, while not over, was entering its final phase. The steward went from house to house with his measuring cup and his ledger, recording who received what, listening to the expressions of gratitude that bordered on worship. The grain he distributed was not much, perhaps a week's worth for a small family if they were careful, but it was enough. It was the difference between making it to April or not. When the steward came to Margaret's cottage, he was shocked by her appearance. He had seen her just 2 weeks earlier and she had been thin, certainly, but functional. Now she looked skeletal, her eyes too large in her face, her hands trembling as she reached for the grain. "You should see Father Bernhard," he said with concern. "He may have some herbs or remedies that could help with that cough." Margaret nodded but said nothing, not trusting her voice, knowing that if she tried to speak she would only start coughing again. Anna thanked the steward on her mother's behalf and closed the door gently. That night, Anna and Jochen had a whispered conversation while their mother slept fitfully by the fire. "She is very sick," Anna said, stating what they both knew but had been afraid to acknowledge. "What if she dies?" Jochen asked, his voice small and frightened. He was 12 years old, but at that moment he sounded much younger, a child who desperately needed his mother. Anna put her arm around around her brother's shoulders. "She will not die," she said with a firmness she did not entirely feel. "She is the strongest person I know. She kept us alive all winter. She will not leave us now." But even as she spoke these words, she wondered if they were true or if she was simply trying to convince herself. The next morning, Anna left Jochen to watch over their mother and walked to the church to find Father Bernhard. The priest was in the cemetery behind the church, measuring out plots for the bodies that would need to be buried once the ground softened. He looked up as Anna approached, and something in her expression made him set down his measuring rope immediately. "What is wrong, child?" he asked gently. Anna explained about her mother's cough, about the fever, about her growing weakness. Father Bernhard listened carefully, then nodded. "I will come," he said simply. "Let me gather some things that might help." He went into the church and returned with a small basket containing various items, dried herbs that he had saved from the previous summer, a bottle of honey that had been given to the church as a tithe, a vial of oil that had been blessed. These were precious things, items that could have been traded for food, but Father Bernhard did not hesitate to share them. He had learned over the long winter that community survival was more important than any individual possession. If Margaret died, her children would likely die as well, or at best end up as orphans dependent on the charity of a village that had little charity to spare. Better to use what resources existed to keep families intact. He accompanied Anna back to the cottage, moving slowly through the muddy streets, pausing occasionally to catch his breath. The winter had aged him, adding years to his appearance that would never entirely fade. When they entered the cottage, he found Margaret awake but disoriented, the fever having risen during Anna's absence. She did not immediately recognize the priest, and when she did, she tried to sit up to be properly respectful, but he waved her back down. "Peace, Margaret," he said softly. "I am here as a healer, not as your priest." "Well, both perhaps, but the healing is more urgent at the moment." He examined her as best he could, with his limited medical knowledge. He listened to her breathing, noting the wet, crackling sound in her lungs. He felt her forehead and found it burning. He looked at her fingers and saw the bluish tinge to her nails that spoke of poor circulation. The diagnosis was not difficult. She had lung fever, what in later centuries would be called pneumonia, brought on by months of poor nutrition, stress, and exposure to cold. In a healthy person with adequate food and warmth and rest, such an illness might be overcome. In someone as weakened as Margaret, it was potentially fatal. But Father Bernhard did not share these grim thoughts. Instead, he set about doing what he could. He made tea from the dried herbs, elderflower, yarrow, and mint, and helped Margaret drink it despite her protests that she did not want to waste such precious resources. "It is not a waste if it helps you live," he said firmly. He mixed some of the honey with warm water and had her drink that as well, the sweetness providing both comfort and a small amount of nutrition. He anointed her forehead with the blessed oil and said prayers over her, not the prayers for the dying, but prayers for healing, for strength, for perseverance. Then he sat down with Anna and Jochen and spoke to them with the frankness that he believed children deserved. even in difficult circumstances. "Your mother is very ill," he said. "The sickness is in her lungs, and she is weak from the winter. I will not lie to you and say she will certainly recover, but I will also not give up hope. She has survived this far, which means she is stronger than many. What she needs now is rest, warmth, and food. The rest and warmth you can provide. The food is more difficult, but spring is coming. In another week or two, there will be plants you can gather: dandelion greens, wild garlic, nettles. These will help restore her strength." He taught them how to make the herbal tea, leaving them most of the dried herbs from his basket. He showed them how to create a tent over their mother, using blankets to trap the steam from boiling water, helping her breathe more easily. He instructed Anna to keep her mother's fever down by bathing her face and hands with cool water. And then, because he had other parishioners to visit, other people who needed his help, he took his leave, promising to return in a few days to check on Margareth's progress. After he left, Anna and Jochen followed his instructions carefully. They made the tea and helped their mother drink it. They created the steam tent and saw how it did indeed seem to ease her breathing. They took turns sitting with her through the night, keeping the fire fed, making sure she did not throw off her blankets in her fever-induced restlessness. It was exhausting work for two young people who were themselves still recovering from the winter's deprivations, but they never considered not doing it. She was their mother. She had kept them alive. Now it was their turn to keep her alive. Days passed in this way, each one bringing small improvements in Margareth's condition. The fever came and went, but gradually became less intense. The cough remained, but lost some of its frightening depth. She began to stay awake for longer periods, to speak coherently, to recognize where she was and what was happening. Anna continued to search for any available food, trading their last few possessions: a brass pot, a wooden spoon that had been her grandmother's, for handfuls of grain or dried peas. Jochen, feeling stronger as the weather warmed, began to venture farther from the cottage, looking for the early spring plants that Father Bernhard had mentioned. The first edible plant he found was a patch of winter cress growing near the river where the snow had melted earliest. The leaves were bitter but unmistakably nutritious, full of the vitamins that had been so lacking in their winter diet. He gathered as many as he could carry in his shirt, bringing them home in triumph. Anna boiled them with a tiny amount of their grain ration, creating a soup that was more green than anything else, but tasted like life itself after months of leather and tree bark. Margareth ate a small bowl and pronounced it the most delicious thing she had ever tasted, and perhaps in that moment, it truly was. As March turned to April, the transformation of the landscape accelerated. The river broke free entirely, its ice shattering in a single dramatic day of cracking and groaning and rushing water. Children lined the banks to watch the ice floes surge downstream, great chunks of white and blue grinding against each other as they went. The sound of moving water filled the valley, a constant presence that was both soothing and exciting, a reminder that the world was alive again, that things flowed and changed and renewed themselves. Birds began to return from wherever they had gone during the frozen months. First came the crows and ravens, hardy opportunists who were always first to take advantage of changing conditions. Then came smaller birds, robins and sparrows and finches, filling the air with songs that people had almost forgotten existed. Jachin would stand outside the cottage in the early morning, listening to the bird calls, and feel something like joy stirring in his chest. The world had been silent for so long that the return of sound, of life, was almost overwhelming. The first truly warm day came in mid-April, when the sun broke through the clouds and the temperature rose to a point where people could go outside without their heavy cloaks. It felt like a miracle, like a gift from God, like everything they had suffered through had been worth it just to experience this moment of warmth on their faces. Margaret, still weak but improving daily, was helped outside by her children to sit in the sun for a few minutes. She closed her eyes and turned her face upward, feeling the warmth soak into her skin, into her bones, chasing away the deep cold that had lived inside her for so long. Tears ran down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of simple animal pleasure at being alive. Other families in Rothbach were experiencing similar moments. Thomas the cobbler and his wife sat outside their cottage holding hands, not speaking, just being together in the warmth. The children who had survived were running and playing again, their laughter a sound that had been absent for months. People were beginning to smile, to make plans, to think about the future instead of merely trying to survive the present. The scars of winter would remain, physical, emotional, psychological, but they were survivors, and survivors know how to carry their scars and keep living anyway. Graf Heinrich called a meeting of all the village heads and the representatives of the various households that made up his estate. They gathered in the great hall of the castle, perhaps 40 people in all, looking thin and tired but undeniably alive. The Graf stood before them and spoke without his usual formal distance. "We have endured something that I hope none of us ever has to endure again," he said. "We have lost friends, family members, neighbors. We have suffered beyond what most people will ever know, but we have survived. And now we must think about what comes next." He outlined his plans for the spring planting, for rebuilding the village, for helping those families who had lost their primary breadwinners to find new arrangements. He announced a reduction in the rents and tithes for the coming year, acknowledging that people needed time to recover their strength and rebuild their stores. This was not generosity exactly. Heinrich was too practical a man to be purely generous, but rather recognition that an estate with healthy, adequately fed workers was more valuable than an estate that extracted every possible ounce of production from desperate, starving people. He also did something unusual for a nobleman of his time and place. He thanked them. He thanked them for their endurance, for their determination, for not giving up even when giving up would have been easier. He acknowledged that their survival was their own accomplishment, not something he had granted them, and that he was honored to be the lord of people who had shown such strength. It was a short speech, not flowery or eloquent, but it came from a place of genuine respect, and the people heard that in his words. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, and then someone began to clap, and then others joined in, and soon the hall was filled with applause, not for the Graf specifically, but for all of them, for their collective survival, for the simple fact that they had made it through. Father Bernhard, who had been present at the meeting, offered a prayer of thanksgiving. He spoke of the valley of the shadow of death, of walking through it and emerging on the other side. He spoke of the lessons they had learned about community, about sacrifice, about the resilience of the human spirit. He spoke of the dead, asking God to welcome them into eternal rest, acknowledging that they too had fought bravely even though they had ultimately lost their battle. And he spoke of the future, of the spring that was upon them, of the planting and growing and harvesting that would come, of the children who would be born and the lives that would continue. When he said, "Amen," the word was echoed by every voice in the hall, a chorus of affirmation that seemed to rise up and fill the stone space with hope. The planting season began in earnest in late April. The ground was still cold and wet, but it was workable, and the farmers went into their fields with a determination born of necessity. Every seed was precious. Every plant that grew was a victory. People worked from dawn to dusk, pushing themselves even though they were still recovering from the winter, knowing that what they planted now would determine whether they ate next winter or starved again. No one wanted to face another winter like the one they had just survived. They would do everything in their power to prevent it. Margaret recovered slowly but steadily. By early May, she was able to move about the cottage without assistance, though she tired easily and still had occasional bouts of coughing. Anna had taken over many of the household responsibilities and proved herself capable beyond her years. She could bake bread, tend the fire, mend clothes, and manage their limited resources with the careful attention to detail that winter had taught them all. Jochen had grown during the hard months, not physically. He was still small for his age, but in maturity and capability. He could hunt for edible plants, set snares for rabbits, help with the heavier work that his mother could no longer manage. The three of them had become a tight unit, bound together by shared suffering and shared survival. One evening in mid-May, as they sat around their table eating a meal of spring greens and rabbit stew, a feast compared to the leather soup of winter, Margaret looked at her children and felt a wave of love so intense it was almost painful. They had all been so close to death, all teetering on the edge of the abyss, and yet here they were together, alive, eating real food and making plans for tomorrow. "I am proud of you both," she said suddenly. Anna and Jochen looked up in surprise. Their mother was not usually given emotional declarations. "You saved my life," Margaret continued. "When I was sick, you cared for me. You did not give up. You were braver than anyone should have to be at your age. I want you to know that I see that. I am grateful for it." Anna's eyes filled with tears. "You saved us first, Mama," she said softly. "Everything you did, all winter long. Give us your food, keeping us warm. Never let us see how scared you were, even though you must have been terrified." Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "We saved each other," she said. "That is what families do." Jochen, uncomfortable with the emotional intensity but moved nonetheless, mumbled something about how they were all very brave, and could they please eat now before the stew got cold. The three of them laughed, and the moment of heavy emotion passed, but something had been acknowledged, something important had been said. As spring progressed into summer, life in Rothbach slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. The fields greened and grew. The gardens produced vegetables. The forest provided mushrooms and berries and small game. People began to regain weight, to look less gaunt and haunted. Children started to play with real energy again, running and shouting and being children in ways they had not been able to during the long winter. Gradually, very gradually, the memory of those terrible months began to fade, not disappearing entirely but losing its immediate, visceral quality. But some things had changed permanently. The community had been transformed by what they had endured together. People who might have been rivals or merely indifferent neighbors in normal times had become deeply connected through shared suffering. They had seen each other at their worst and at their best. They had shared their last scraps of food, had helped each other bury their dead, had refused to abandon one another even when self-preservation might have dictated otherwise. These bonds would last for the rest of their lives and would be passed down to their children as stories of the Starvation Winter of 1437. Thomas the cobbler, who had given away so much of his leather to help feed others, found that people remembered his generosity. They brought him work without being asked, paid him a little extra when they could, helped him repair his cottage and workshop. He had not given away his leather expecting any return, but the return came anyway, in the form of a community that valued him and took care of him in turn. It was a quiet lesson in the economics of kindness, in how generosity creates its own returns in ways that cannot be calculated on a ledger. Father Bernhard, who had distributed the sacred communion elements to starving children, was never censured by his bishop. Either the church authorities never learned what he had done, or they chose to look the other way, recognizing that desperate times called for practical compassion rather than rigid adherence to rules. The priest himself never regretted his decision, though he did write a long letter to his bishop explaining his reasoning, just in case. The letter was never answered, and Father Bernhard took the silence as tacit approval. He continued to serve his parish for another 15 years, and when he died, the entire village turned out for his funeral, mourning him as a man who had truly embodied the Christian virtues of charity and sacrifice. Graf Heinrich's decision to continue rationing to the village, even at the cost of his own household's comfort, earned him a loyalty from his people that lasted for generations. In a time when lords often exploited their peasants mercilessly, Heinrich had chosen a different path, and his descendants would benefit from that choice for centuries to come. The von Rothbach name became associated with fairness and responsible stewardship, a reputation that served the family well through the many upheavals that would shake Europe in the coming centuries. As for Margarethe, Anna, and Jochen, they continued their lives in the small cottage at the edge of Rothbach. Anna eventually married a young farmer from a neighboring village, a quiet man who had also survived the Starvation Winter and who understood, without being told, the value of a woman who knew how to endure hardship. Jochen grew into a strong young man, learned his father's trade as a woodworker, and eventually took over a small workshop in the village. He never grew very tall, the malnutrition of his youth having stunted his growth, but he was skilled and hardworking and well-respected. Margaret lived to see her grandchildren born, to hold them in her arms and tell them stories of the old days. She never spoke much about the Starvation Winter, finding the memories too painful to revisit casually. But once, when her oldest granddaughter asked why she never threw away even the smallest scrap of food, why she saved every crust of bread and every bone for soup, Margaret tried to explain. "There was a winter once," she said slowly, "when we had almost nothing. When we boiled leather boots to make soup, because there was nothing else. When every day was a struggle just to stay alive." The granddaughter's eyes went wide. "That sounds terrible, Grandma." Margaret nodded. "It was terrible. But it also showed me what matters. It showed me that you can survive things you never thought you could survive. That people can be kind even when they have nothing. That family is everything." She paused, looking out the window at the fields, green and abundant. "I never want to go through something like that again. But I am grateful for what it taught me." The leather boots that Margaret had boiled that terrible winter became, in their way, a symbol. She told the story to her children, and they told it to theirs, and it became part of the family lore, a reminder of how far they had come, of what their ancestors had endured. In later generations, when the family faced other hardships, wars, plagues, economic troubles, someone would invariably say, "Well, at least we're not boiling our shoes." And everyone would understand the reference, would understand that they came from people who had survived the unsurvivable, and that this strength ran in their blood. The Starvation Winter of 1437 was not unique in European history. There would be other terrible winters, other famines, other times when desperate people were reduced to eating things that should never be food. But for the people of Rothbach and the surrounding villages, this winter was their trial, their crucible, the defining experience that shaped how they understood themselves and their world. They had looked death in the face and had refused to blink. They had maintained their humanity when it would have been easier to descend into savagery. They had chosen community over individual survival, generosity over hoarding, hope over despair. Years later, traveling merchants who passed through the region would sometimes hear stories about the winter when people had boiled their leather shoes for food. Some dismissed these stories as exaggerations, as peasant tales grew larger in the telling. But others, who had themselves experienced hard times, recognized the truth in the stories. They knew that human beings were capable of enduring extraordinary hardship, that the line between civilization and chaos was thinner than most people like to believe, and that sometimes the most mundane objects, a pair of old boots, a leather belt, could mean the difference between life and death. The physical evidence of that winter gradually disappeared. The bodies that had been stored in the shed were eventually buried in proper graves once the ground thawed. The cottages that had collapsed under the weight of snow were rebuilt. The empty barns were filled again with hay and livestock. The fields that had lain frozen and barren came back to life, producing harvests that filled the granaries and the bellies of those who worked them. Within a few years, if you had walked through Rothbach without knowing its history, You would have seen nothing to indicate what had happened there. It looked like any other small German village, modest, hardworking, unremarkable. But if you had looked closely at the people, you might have noticed something. A certain quality in their eyes, perhaps. A way of looking at food, at shelter, at each other, that suggested they knew something that more fortunate people did not know. They knew what it felt like to be truly hungry, not the comfortable hunger of missing a meal, but the deep, gnawing hunger that becomes a constant companion, a voice in your head that never stops talking. They knew what it felt like to be so cold that you wondered if you would ever be warm again. They knew what it felt like to watch someone you loved waste away and be unable to help them. And they knew what it felt like to survive anyway, to wake up on the other side of that darkness and realize that you were still alive, still here, still capable of joy and love and hope. These were not the kind of lessons anyone would choose to learn, but having learned them, having paid for them with months of suffering and the lives of friends and neighbors, the survivors held onto them fiercely. They built their lives on the foundation of what they had learned in that terrible winter. They taught their children to be grateful for what they had, to never waste food, to help their neighbors, to endure. And their children taught these lessons to their children, and so on down through the generations, until the specific memory of boiling leather shoes faded into general principles about the importance of resilience and community, and never taking abundance for granted. In the church at Rothbach, Father Bernhard eventually commissioned a memorial plaque to be mounted on the wall. It was a simple thing, made of wood since the parish could not afford stone or metal, with names carved into it, the names of those who had died during the Starvation Winter of 1437. There were more than 30 names, ranging from infants to elderly people, each representing a life cut short by hunger and cold. Below the names was a short inscription in Latin that translated roughly to, "They endured to the end. May they rest in eternal peace. May we remember their sacrifice." The plaque hung in the church for centuries, watched over by generation after generation of priests and parishioners. Eventually, the wood aged and darkened, the carved letters becoming harder to read, but the plaque remained, a tangible reminder of a time that should never be forgotten. Occasionally, a young person would ask their grandparents about the names on the plaque, and the old people would tell the stories they had heard from their own grandparents, stories of the winter when snow fell for months without stopping, when food ran out and people were reduced to eating leather and bark, when death walked through the village taking whom it pleased. And as these stories were told and retold, certain details became polished smooth by repetition, like river stones worn by water. The exact sequence of events might blur, dates might shift, but the essential truth remained, that there had been a winter of almost unimaginable hardship, and that the people had faced it with courage and compassion. The children listening to these stories would feel a mixture of horror and fascination, trying to imagine what it must have been like, grateful that they lived in easier times, and secretly wondering if they would have been brave enough to survive such an ordeal. Margaret herself became something of a minor legend in the village, though she would have been embarrassed to know it. People spoke of the widow who had kept her children alive through the worst of the winter, who had thought to boil her husband's boots when all other food was gone, who had nearly died of lung fever in the spring, but had fought her way back to health through sheer determination. Young women facing their own hardships would sometimes say to each other, "Be like Margaret," meaning, "Be strong, be resourceful, do not give up even when everything seems hopeless." It was a compliment of the highest order, though Margaret herself never quite understood why people looked at her with such respect. She had only done what any mother would do, try to keep her children alive. That it had required extraordinary measures was simply a function of extraordinary circumstances. As Margaret grew older, her memories of that winter became both more distant and more vivid, the way long ago events sometimes do. Whole weeks of that terrible time might be lost to her recollection, but certain moments remained crystal clear. The sound the leather made as she cut it into pieces, the desperate look in Anna's eyes when she had been too weak to rise from her pallet, the taste of that first meal of spring greens after months of near starvation. These memories would come to her unbidden, usually at quiet moments when her hands were occupied with some simple task and her mind was free to wander. She would be spinning wool or mending clothes, and suddenly she would be back in that frozen winter, feeling the cold, hearing the silence that had settled over the snow-covered village like a shroud. She never spoke of these memories to most people, finding them too personal, too painful to share casually. But occasionally, late at night when she could not sleep, she would talk to her husband's spirit, carrying on the one-sided conversations that widows have with the dead. "Do you remember your boots?" she would whisper into the darkness. "The ones with the good thick leather that the cobbler made for you the year before you died. I boiled them, love. I cut them to pieces and boiled them for soup. I hope you would not mind. I hope you will understand." The children were so hungry, and I did not know what else to do. And in her mind, she could hear his response, gentle and understanding, telling her that of course he did not mind, that he would have done the same, that keeping their children alive was all that mattered. The summer of 1437, following that terrible winter, was one of the most beautiful summers anyone could remember. The sun shone warm and generous. The rains came at exactly the right times, and the crops grew with almost miraculous speed and abundance. It was as if nature itself was apologizing for the cruelty of winter, offering compensation in the form of perfect growing weather. The grain grew tall and thick in the fields. The vegetable gardens overflowed with produce. The fruit trees, which had barely bloomed the previous year, were heavy with apples and pears and plums. The forest was full of mushrooms and berries. The river teemed with fish. There was abundance after scarcity, plenty after deprivation, and people hardly knew how to process this sudden reversal of fortune. The harvest that fall was the best anyone had seen in a decade. The granaries filled to capacity, then filled some more, the surplus stored in every available space. Graf Heinrich, looking at the bounty, made a decision that his steward thought was foolish, but that the Graf knew was necessary. He ordered that an additional storehouse be built, larger than the others, and that it be filled with grain and dried goods and kept as an emergency reserve, never to be touched except in times of direst need. "We will never be caught unprepared again," he said firmly. "If another winter like the last one comes, we will be ready." The storehouse was built of good stone, with a solid roof and doors that could be locked securely. And it was filled, sack after sack of grain carried in and stacked carefully, insurance against a future that might never come, but that no one wanted to face unprepared. Other families made their own preparations, their own vows to never be caught so vulnerable again. Those who could afford it planted additional gardens, put up extra preserves, salted more meat than strictly necessary. People saved seeds with almost religious devotion, knowing that seeds were potential food, potential life. The attitude toward waste changed fundamentally. Before the Starvation Winter, people had thought nothing of throwing away a heel of stale bread or tossing scraps to the pigs. After the winter, every scrap was saved, every bit of food treated as precious. Children who left food on their plates were scolded sharply. To waste food was not merely careless. It was almost sinful, a betrayal of those who had died for lack of it. This new frugality, born of trauma, became embedded in the culture of Rothbach and passed down through generations. Even in times of plenty, even in years when the harvests were abundant and food was cheap, the people of Rothbach remained careful, conservative, unwilling to take abundance for granted. This gave them a reputation for being miserly or overly cautious, but it also meant that when hard times did come again, as they inevitably did over the centuries, Rothbach weathered them better than many other villages. They had their emergency stores. They had their habits of careful rationing. They had their collective memory of what could happen when winter was cruel and preparations were inadequate. Thomas the cobbler continued to practice his trade for another 20 years after the Starvation Winter, but his relationship to his work changed subtly. Before, he had taken pride in creating beautiful, well-crafted boots and shoes, items that would last for years with proper care. After the winter, he could never quite forget that leather, no matter how beautifully worked, was ultimately just material that could be sacrificed if necessary. It gave him a strange perspective on his own craftsmanship. Pride in the work, yes, but also a clear-eyed understanding that the most important function of any object was not its beauty, but its utility in keeping people alive. He began to make simpler, sturdier goods, less decoration and more durability. And he always kept scraps of leather in a separate box, marked clearly, so that if anyone ever needed leather for something other than shoes, for food if it came to that, they would know where to find it. His children, who had been very young during the Starvation Winter, retained only fragmentary memories of that time. They remembered being hungry, remembered their mother crying, remembered the cold that seemed to seep into everything. But the specific details were lost to them, replaced by the stories they heard later. This was probably for the best. The weight of those memories was heavy enough for those who carried them fully. The children had the luxury of knowing about the winter without being haunted by it, of learning its lessons without bearing its scars. They grew up cautious and grateful, respectful of food and warmth and the fragility of life, but not broken by trauma. They were the next generation, the ones who would carry the community forward, and they did so with the strength of survivors without the burden of direct suffering. Anna's wedding, when it came 2 years after the Starvation Winter, was a modest affair by necessity. The village was still recovering economically, but it felt like a celebration of more than just her marriage. It was a celebration of survival, of continuity, of life going on despite everything. The whole village turned out for the ceremony in Father Bernhard's church, and afterward there was a feast that, while not lavish, included real meat and fresh bread and vegetables and even some wine. People ate with appreciation, savoring every bite, conscious of how different this meal was from the leather soup and bark porridge of 2 years earlier. Margaret watched her daughter marry with emotions that were complex and bittersweet. She was happy, of course, happy to see Anna beginning her own life, happy that the young woman had survived to see this day. But she was also acutely aware of her husband's absence, of how he should have been here to walk their daughter to the altar, to give her away to her new husband. She felt his ghost standing beside her through the ceremony, felt certain that he was watching from whatever place the dead watch from, proud of the daughter they had raised together, grateful that their children had survived when so many others had not. At the feast afterward, Graf Heinrich stood and gave a toast that was unusual for a nobleman addressing peasants. 2 years ago, he said, his voice carrying across the gathering, we faced a trial that tested every one of us. We lost people we loved. We suffered in ways that I hope we never suffer again, but we survived. And tonight, we celebrate not just the marriage of Anna and her husband, but the fact that we are here, alive, able to gather together and share food and drink and joy. We are a community that has been through fire, or rather, through ice, and we have emerged intact. That is worth celebrating. People raised their cups and drank, and there was a feeling in the air of shared understanding, of collective pride. They had been through something terrible together, and that shared experience had bound them in ways that could never be broken. They were not just neighbors anymore, not just fellow villagers. They were survivors, comrades, people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and had chosen to help rather than abandon one another. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed more freely, the mood lightened. There was music, someone had a fiddle, someone else a flute, and people danced, awkwardly at first, their bodies still remembering the weakness of winter, but then with more energy as the music and the wine and the simple joy of being alive took over. Children ran between the adults' legs, playing games that had been suspended during the long, cold months. Old people sat together and told stories, their voices rising and falling in the warm summer air. It was, in every way, a celebration of life, a defiant assertion that winter had not won, that they were still here, still capable of joy and hope and love. Jochen, who was 14 now and between childhood and adulthood, watched the festivities with the particular intensity of the young, trying to memorize every detail, knowing somehow that this was an important moment, one he would want to remember. He saw his sister dancing with her new husband, both of them smiling in a way that made them look younger than they were. He saw his mother sitting with the other widows, talking quietly, occasionally laughing at something one of them said. He saw Father Bernhard accepting a cup of wine from someone, blessing it with a gesture that was half serious, half playful. He saw the Graf and his wife standing a little apart from the common people but not too far, maintaining their social distance, but also their connection to the community they ruled. And he thought about the winter, about what they had all been through. He thought about the leather soup his mother had made, about the strange, bitter taste of it, about how grateful he had been for even that meager sustenance. He thought about the cold that had seemed to go on forever, about the silence that had settled over the village like a blanket, about the fear that had lived in his chest through those long months. And then he looked around at the celebration, at the food and the music and the dancing, and he felt a sense of wonder at the resilience of human beings, at their ability to endure terrible things. And then, when the terrible things were over, to find joy again, to celebrate, to live. The years passed, as years do, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. There were good harvests and bad harvests, though none quite as bad as the summer before the Starvation Winter. There were births and deaths, marriages and funerals, the ordinary rhythm of life in a small village. The memory of the Starvation Winter remained, but it began to fade, to lose its sharp edges, to become history rather than lived experience. The young people who had not experienced it directly heard the stories, but could not fully grasp what it had been like. How could they understand true starvation when they had never missed more than a meal or two? How could they comprehend that kind of cold when the winters they experienced were merely uncomfortable rather than lethal? But certain practices persisted, kept alive by those who remembered. The emergency storehouse was maintained, always kept full, checked regularly to ensure that the grain had not spoiled or been invaded by rodents. Every fall after the harvest, there was a ceremony of sorts where the storehouse was opened. The old grain was distributed to those who needed it, and fresh grain was stored in its place. It became a tradition, this rotation of the emergency supply, and even people who did not remember the Starvation Winter participated in it, understanding that it was important even if they did not fully understand why. Margaret lived to see her grandchildren grow, to hold her first great-grandchild in her arms when she was in her 60s. She became one of the village elders, a woman whose advice was sought on matters ranging from the practical to the spiritual. She had earned a kind of authority through her survival, through the choices she had made, through the simple fact that she had kept her family intact through the worst of times. When younger women faced hardships of their own, difficult pregnancies, sick children, abusive husbands, they sometimes came to Margaret for counsel. She did not always have answers, but she listened, and she shared what wisdom she had accumulated through her years of struggle and survival. One piece of advice she gave repeatedly: things are never as hopeless as they seem. I have boiled leather for soup. I have watched my daughter nearly die of starvation. I have been so cold I thought I would never be warm again. And yet here I am, alive, with children and grandchildren, sitting in the sun and feeling grateful. If I could survive that, you can survive whatever you are facing. You are stronger than you know. The younger women would nod and sometimes cry, and they would leave her cottage feeling a little bit stronger, a little bit more capable of facing their own trials. As Margaret approached the end of her life, she died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 67, an impressive age for a woman of her time and circumstances. She found herself thinking often about the Starvation Winter, not with fear or horror anymore, but with a kind of philosophical acceptance. That winter had been the defining experience of her life, the crucible that had shaped everything that came after. It had taken so much from her health, her husband's possessions, years of ease and comfort that she would never get back. But it had also given her something, an absolute certainty about what mattered and what did not, about the strength that lived within her, about the goodness that could exist even in the darkest of times. In her final days, when she knew that death was approaching, she called Anna and Jachin to her bedside. They came immediately, both of them middle-aged now, with children and grandchildren of their own, but still her bobbies in her eyes. "I want you to remember something," she told them, her voice weak but clear. "When I am gone, I want you to tell your children and your children's children about the winter when we boiled leather for soup. Not because I want them to remember suffering, but because I want them to remember that we survived, that we helped each other, that we did not lose our humanity even when we had lost almost everything else. That is the important part. Not the suffering itself, but how we responded to it." Anna and Jachin promised, tears running down their faces, and Margaret smiled and closed her eyes, feeling content. She had done what she set out to do. She had kept her children alive. She had seen them grow into strong, good people. She had contributed to her community. She had lived a life that mattered, even though it had been a hard life, a life of struggle and sacrifice. As she drifted off to sleep for the last time, she found herself thinking about her husband, about seeing him again soon in whatever came after death. She imagined him waiting for her, smiling, saying something like, "You did well, love. You kept them safe. Come rest now. You have earned it." The funeral was well attended, as funerals of respected elders always are in small communities. Father Bernhard, who was himself quite old by this point and would die within the year, gave the eulogy. He spoke of Margaret's strength and courage, of her devotion to her family, of the example she had set for others. He mentioned the Starvation Winter, though briefly, acknowledging that it had been a defining time for many in the village, a time that had revealed people's true character. "Margaret," he said, "showed us what it means to be strong. Not the strength of never breaking, but the strength of breaking and then putting yourself back together. The strength of making impossible choices and living with them. The strength of choosing to help others even when you have almost nothing yourself. This is the kind of strength that builds communities, that sustains life, that gives meaning to our time on this earth." The people gathered in the church murmured their agreement, and when Margaret's body was carried to the cemetery for burial, many of them wept, not just for her, but for all that she represented, for the memory of those hard times that were fading but not forgotten, for the knowledge that they were losing one of the last direct links to an experience that had shaped their community in fundamental ways. Years turned into decades and decades into centuries. The Starvation Winter of 1437 receded further and further into the past, becoming history, then legend, then a barely remembered story that old people told on cold nights. The village of Rothbach changed, as all places change. New families moved in, old families died out. The political landscape of Europe shifted and transformed. Wars came and went, plagues swept through, taking their toll, economic systems evolved. Technology advanced. The medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, then to the Enlightenment, then to the Industrial Age. But some echoes of that winter remained, embedded in the culture and practices of the place in ways that people no longer consciously recognized. The emergency storehouse was maintained for centuries, long after anyone remembered why it had been built in the first place. The habit of careful food preservation, of never wasting anything, persisted even when it was no longer strictly necessary. The sense of community solidarity, of helping one another in times of need, remained stronger in Rothbach than in many other places. These were the ghosts of the Starvation Winter, haunting the descendants of those who had lived through it, shaping their behavior in subtle but significant ways. The memorial plaque in the church, with its list of names and its Latin inscription, remained on the wall for 400 years. In the 19th century, when the church was renovated, there was a discussion about removing it. The wood had deteriorated badly, and the names were barely legible anymore. But the village historian, a young man who had been researching local records, argued passionately for its preservation. "This plaque," he said, "is the only physical reminder we have of one of the most significant events in our village's history. Yes, it is old and damaged, but that is part of its value. It connects us to our past in a tangible way. If we remove it, we lose something irreplaceable." The plaque was preserved, though carefully, and a new one was made from the old records, listing the same names in more durable stone. The original wooden plaque was moved to a small village museum, where it remains to this day, a fragile artifact of a long-ago winter that tested human endurance to its limits. Visitors to the museum sometimes pause in front of it, reading the faded names, trying to imagine what it must have been like to live through such a time. Most cannot truly comprehend it. How could they, in an age of grocery stores and central heating, of abundance and comfort? But they sense something, a weight of history, a reminder that the ease of their own lives is relatively recent, that their ancestors struggled in ways they can barely imagine. The story of Margaret boiling her husband's leather boots was recorded by the village historian in the 19th century, based on oral traditions that had been passed down through multiple generations. He included it in his comprehensive history of Rothbach, noting that while some details might have been embellished over the years, the core truth of the story was verified by contemporary records. The parish records from 1437 showed the elevated mortality rate during the winter months. The Graph's records showed the grain distributions and the rations implemented. Father Bernhard's own journal, discovered in the church archives, contained entries describing the desperate conditions and his decision to distribute communion elements to the starving. The historian's work ensured that the memory of the Starvation Winter would not be lost entirely, would not fade into complete obscurity. His book was read by scholars and local history enthusiasts, and occasionally by descendants of the original families, people tracing their genealogies back through the centuries, discovering that their ancestors had lived through this remarkable trial. These descendants would sometimes feel a strange connection to people they had never known, a sense of pride mixed with sorrow, gratitude that they themselves had been spared such suffering, wonder at the resilience that must have run in their bloodline. In the 21st century, the story of the Starvation Winter of 1437 exists primarily in academic texts and local archives, a footnote in the larger history of European climate and agricultural crisis during the late Middle Ages. Climate scientists studying the Little Ice Age reference it as an example of the extreme weather events that characterized that period. Social historians use it to illustrate medieval survival strategies and community resilience. Anthropologists examine it as a case study in how humans adapt to environmental stress. The leather boots, long since consumed and digested and returned to the earth, live on as a symbol, a reminder that survival sometimes requires consuming the things we thought were permanent, sacrificing what we thought we could never sacrifice, finding sustenance in the most unlikely places. But beyond the academic interest, beyond the historical significance, the story resonates on a more fundamental human level. It speaks to something universal in the human experience, the capacity to endure, to adapt, to find hope even in the darkest circumstances. Margaret, cutting her husband's boots into pieces, boiling them in a pot over her fire, was not doing anything heroic in the traditional sense. She was simply doing what needed to be done to keep her children alive. She was being a mother, a survivor, a human being faced with impossible choices and making the best decisions she could with the limited resources available. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Starvation Winter of 1437. Not that suffering is noble, not that hardship builds character, not any of the comfortable platitudes that people who have never truly suffered like to tell themselves. The lesson is simpler and more profound, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary resilience when circumstances demand it, that communities can come together in times of crisis, can support one another, can maintain their humanity even when stripped of almost everything else, that life persists, stubbornly and magnificently, even in the face of conditions that seem designed to extinguish it. The people of Rothbach did not choose to face that terrible winter. They would have much preferred an ordinary winter, with adequate food and moderate cold and the usual minor hardships. But when the terrible winter came, they faced it. They adapted, they helped each other, they made sacrifices. They endured. And when it was over, they did not simply collapse in relief but picked themselves up, rebuilt what needed rebuilding, planted their fields, raised their children, and continued living. This is not a story about heroes. It is a story about survival, which is both more difficult and more important than heroism. As we reach the end of this tale, as the last echoes of that winter fade into the silence of history, we might take a moment to reflect on what we have heard. The cold that seeped into every corner of every dwelling. The hunger that gnawed at empty bellies. The difficult choices that had to be made again and again. the losses that were sustained, the grief that was carried, but also the moments of kindness. Gerda bringing fish to Margaret, Thomas giving away his leather, Father Bernhard distributing sacred elements to starving children, Graf Heinrich continuing to ration the village even at cost to his own household. These acts of compassion, small in themselves, were what ultimately saved the community. Not just physically, though they did help people survive, but spiritually, morally, helping them maintain the sense that they were still human beings, still connected to one another by bonds that meant something. The leather boots that became soup are long gone, returned to the earth through the natural processes of digestion and decay. But the story of those boots remains, passed down through generations, recorded in books, preserved in the collective memory of a place and its people. And in that story, we find something worth remembering. That desperation can lead to creativity. That necessity truly is the mother of invention. That when conventional food sources are exhausted, human beings will find other ways to survive. We find that community matters, that solidarity is not just a pleasant ideal but a practical necessity in times of crisis. We find that the ordinary objects of our lives, shoes, belts, the possessions we take for granted, might someday be all that stands between us and starvation, and that we should perhaps view them with a bit more appreciation, a bit more awareness of their potential value beyond their primary function. Most importantly, we find hope. Because if Margaret and Anna and Jochen could survive the Starvation Winter of 1437, if they could endure months of cold and hunger and fear, and still emerge intact on the other side, still capable of joy and love and building a future, then perhaps we too can face whatever challenges come our way. Perhaps we too have within us reserves of strength we do not know we possess, capacities for endurance and adaptation that only reveal themselves when they are absolutely necessary. Perhaps we too would discover, in our darkest hours, that we are capable of more than we imagined. And so we leave Rothbach as the last light of this story fades, as the centuries roll forward and the medieval village transforms into something new, something modern, but carrying within it still the genetic memory of that winter, the lessons learned in extremis, the knowledge that was purchased at such a high price. We leave Margaret's descendants going about their lives, most of them unaware of the story of the leather boots, but perhaps carrying in their bones some echo of that determination, that refusal to give up, that insistence on survival against all odds. The fire that Margaret tended through that long winter has gone out, of course. The cottage where she lived has crumbled into dust. The bodies that suffered through those frozen months have returned to earth. But something remains, a story, a memory, a reminder that human beings have faced difficult times before and have found ways to survive them. That when we are stripped down to our most essential selves, when all the comfortable layers of civilization and abundance are peeled away, what remains is a core of resilience and determination and love that is remarkably difficult to extinguish. As you settle deeper into your blankets now, warm and comfortable and safe, perhaps you might spare a thought for Margaret and her children, for Thomas and his family, for Father Bernhard and Graf Heinrich and all the others who lived through that terrible winter. Perhaps you might feel grateful for the warmth that surrounds you, for the food in your kitchen, for the ease and comfort of your life. And perhaps, if you face hard times of your own, you might remember that others have faced worse and have survived, and take some small comfort from that knowledge. The starvation winter of 1437 is over. It has been over for more than 600 years, but the story lives on, a testament to human endurance, a reminder of our capacity for both suffering and survival, a gift from our ancestors who faced the darkness and emerged into the light. May we honor their memory by living our lives with gratitude, by helping one another when times are hard, by remembering that we are all connected by the simple fact of our shared humanity, and by never, ever taking for granted the ordinary miracles of warmth and food, and the love of those who matter most to us. Sleep well, friends. Let the story of the winter that tested everything and the people who survived it settle into your dreams like snow falling softly on a quiet village. Let it remind you that morning always comes, that spring always follows winter, that life persists. And in the morning, when you wake to whatever challenges your own life presents, perhaps you will face them with a bit more courage, a bit more determination, knowing that you come from a long line of survivors, that resilience is your birthright, and that even in the coldest winter, even when you are down to boiling leather for soup, hope remains. Good night. Rest peacefully. And remember, you are stronger than you